great deal of confidence yesterday, a good deal of anxiety today. One woman at the telex office of our hotel held my arm this evening and said, "Do you think we'll make it?" And I really couldn't answer this evening on the basis of what we've seen with a great deal of confidence that they would. However, Romanians as a whole are so fiercely angry at what has transpired here over the past 24 years that it seems impossible to me that they will look back on the road that they've decided to take, which is one of total and absolute refusal to tolerate Ceausescu and an authoritarian communist regime one day longer.
NBC News correspondent Arthur Kent in the middle of all of that in Bucharest on the telephone from Romania this evening. And an idea of the confusion, the sheer utter confusion that reigns in this revolution can be seen in fighting at the Bucharest airport. Another NBC correspondent flew right into it. His report and today's news from Panama as we continue.
How about these medical school doctors?
And this is what he found.
The armed men defending Bucharest airport were drawn from border police, the regular army, and a people's militia. They wore thin armbands to recognize each other. They were up against an unknown number of secret police, determined to prevent the revolution for democracy. The first attack came from nowhere. The airport perimeter had been breached. No one knew the strength of the probe. When dawn broke, the motley band defending the airport saw they had beaten off a major assault. They still didn't know if the first wave was over. The relief at having survived and not run was obvious to the young soldiers. Then tanks moved up. No one knew for sure whose side they were on. They flew revolutionary colors from their antennae. Their crews stayed inside, battened down under armored hatches. Police vehicles were also outside, flying no colors at all. The airport defenders carried away their dead. Slain attackers stayed where they had been cut down. 16 attackers were taken alive and led away. Their fate was unclear. 2 officers from the attacking force were being held inside an airport terminal restroom. The militiamen referred to them as pro-Ceausescu terrorists. We weren't told what was planned for them either. It was time to get the wounded to a nearby hospital, then to reload and regroup.
The uncertainty now is about which units of the security forces are still opposed to the army and the new provisional government.
A Romanian Air Force jet appeared from nowhere. All sides tried to bring it down. That started another firefight. All were now unsure about who their real enemies were or exactly where they were. As the light faded, the airport defenders were pulling back from their forward positions to the terminal itself. They were preparing to fight to the end. Tom Asbel, NBC News, Bucharest.
As we reported earlier, Nicolae Ceausescu, his wife, and other family members have been captured. They are being held by the army and will be put on trial, but that has not broken the resistance of those who still support them. The news from Panama.
The new regime announced on television today that Ceausescu and his family have been arrested and will stand trial. But the bloodshed continues as pro-democracy troops battle security forces still loyal to Ceausescu. In the streets of Bucharest and other cities, bands of citizens armed with knives and clubs are joining army troops to resist the dreaded and well-equipped secret police. According to some reports, the death toll is at least 5,000 and could go much higher. Dennis Trout reports from Romania on the day's events.
Serious fighting begins in the early morning, a staccato of machine gun bursts punctuated by cannon fire. Street by street in some neighborhoods, the army is trying to clear areas infested by the security forces still loyal to the deposed dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. The National Museum is set ablaze in the fighting. The television station comes under siege, and the security forces surround and close the country's major airport.
The fear, of course, is that security forces are trying to retake the airport from the army.
But their attack at the airport and other outlying areas may also be simply a feint, so they can mass for a major counteroffensive in the center of Bucharest. The noose around the airport has been tightening for nearly 24 hours.
We was very, very frightened. Very frightened.
The security forces tried to run through the army's defenses in a bus, which was stopped by machine gun fire. The fighting at one point reached to the terminal's front door. During lulls, the army hauled away its casualties. Romanians stranded in the airport combat zone tried to rally their spirits with shouts against the former dictator and with applause for the army, which has joined the people and its new democratic movement. The National Salvation Government announced that Ceausescu had been captured at last, but that could not be proven, and the brutal fight staged by his loyalists continued. The security men are outnumbered in some areas, so there were groups which surrendered. This sniper fell into the hands of an angry crowd and disappeared just as a single shot was fired. But the well-equipped security forces are reported to be holding some towns and sections of others. A massacre of an entire village.
In that country, they held a candlelight vigil at Pioneer Courthouse Square, where they sang hymns for the dead, along with Christmas carols. Among those praying for peace was a former lieutenant in the Romanian Navy who defected to the United States 10 years ago. He says Romanians oppose outside help while the gunfire continues there.
I don't know what is the United States policy or what they think they should do, but Romania do not need any intervention from any other country, not from United States, not from Russia, not from other Warsaw-backed nations, absolutely none.
Jim Hyde now has an update on today's fighting in Romania.
Peace on earth does not apply to Romania on this Christmas Eve. Battles for control of Bucharest continue. Army units that turned against President Nicolae Ceausescu on Friday, allied with civilians, are holding key parts of the capital. But fierce fighting rages there and in the western city of Timișoara, where 4 Western journalists were wounded today while covering the battle. Spokesmen for the new government claim to have captured the dictator who ruled Romania for 24 years, but Ceausescu has not been seen in public. Revolutionary soldiers have found a vast labyrinth of tunnels and safe houses used by secret police who supported his rule. Food and medical aid for Romania are being prepared by the Red Cross, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but the fighting is preventing delivery. The Soviets are sending mixed signals about possible military intervention on the side of the new government. Secretary of State James Baker says the U.S. would not oppose such a move.
I think we would support efforts to assist the Popular Front for National Salvation there in Romania.
The French government has offered to muster a brigade of volunteers to help the insurgents. People in Romania who have suffered religious persecution are now able to play Christmas music in public for the first time in 42 years. Jim Hyde, Channel 2 News.
Meantime, the wife of U.S. Ambassador Alan Punch Green is in Bulgaria tonight. Joan Green led a convoy of Westerners out of the country today. The embassy staff is being reduced to minimum levels. Ambassador Green himself remained in the embassy. A home in southwest Portland was destroyed by fire tonight.
But other top officials are ruling out any plans to send Soviet troops to Romania. Rick Inderfirth has the story from Moscow.
At today's session of the Congress of People's Deputies, Mikhail Gorbachev said the Soviet Union had contacted its Warsaw Pact allies with the aim of providing support to the Romanian people. He said the first planes with medical supplies had already arrived in Bucharest. He also said that a number of other measures were being worked out with the Warsaw Pact, although they apparently do not include military aid. Earlier today, Romanian TV reported that the Soviet embassy had pledged personnel and equipment to help the anti-Ceausescu forces, assistance that would have to be brought in since Soviet troops are not stationed in Romania. But that was virtually ruled out later today in Moscow by Soviet Prime Minister Ryzhkov, who said, to bring in military forces would be impermissible. We must not repeat mistakes. And tonight on Soviet television, there was extensive coverage of the uprising in Romania, calling attention not only to the repudiation of ousted Communist Party chief Ceausescu, but the debt of gratitude many Romanians feel to Mikhail Gorbachev and his reform program of perestroika that has brought about such sweeping changes in Eastern Europe. Rick Inderfirth, ABC News, Moscow.
In Washington, a 24-hour task force has been set up to monitor events in Romania. The U.S. has welcomed Ceausescu's demise, but so far the American reaction has been muted. David Ensor is standing by at the State Department with details.
Carol, a written statement issued by the State Department this evening says that the United States supports the new government of Romania and its commitment to democratic reforms. The statement notes that the new government is besieged by what it calls outlaw members of the secret police still loyal to the dictator Ceausescu. It calls on them to lay down their arms. The statement says the U.S. has already offered humanitarian assistance to the new Romanian government and is looking for ways to supply more emergency medical assistance, which of course is so urgently needed now in Bucharest. The statement also notes that the United States has been in contact with the Soviet Union about the situation in Romania. Carol?
Thank you, David. Reaction elsewhere in the country to the downfall of the Ceausescu government has been positive, at least in one case. In Detroit today, more than 150 Romanian Americans demonstrated on the steps of the federal court building in support of the pro-democracy movement, which ousted the Romanian leader. Elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc, all of Czechoslovakia's political parties have met and nominated Václav Havel for president of the country and Alexander Dubček for chairman of the parliament. Havel is the dissident poet who emerged as leader of the opposition to communist rule, and Dubček was
killed here alone. Many more are injured. Over 30 pro-Ceausescu prisoners are now being held in the airport complex. On the airfield itself, the distant runways are blocked with civilian trucks. And what used to be President Ceausescu's private 707 lies idle on the tarmac. Sources say the former dictator's in hiding, his son's arrested. Anti-Ceausescu forces are pinning their hopes on unconfirmed reports that the Soviet troops may well land at the airport to lend assistance in their fight against the dictator's forces. Many of them say they're already running desperately short of ammunition against increased incoming attacks.
Here at Bucharest Airport, a fierce gun battle has now been going on more or less continuously for several hours between the army and forces still loyal to the Ceausescu regime. They've been using tanks, heavy artillery and machine gun. The dead and injured are still being brought into the main terminal building.
TV screens played martial music. The fighting continued for more than 18 hours, with over 300 civilians huddled for safety in the center of the terminal building. In the cold light of dawn, the tanks became visible, bearing the flag of an army now supporting civilians against Ceausescu. They were joined by militiamen and even civilians armed with obsolete rifles. As Romanians kill Romanians, the years of oppression end in agony. Alex Thompson at Bucharest Airport.
Give rest, O Lord, to your departed servants, in a place of refreshing light and rest.
This is a special service tonight at St. Nicholas Eastern Orthodox Church in southwest Portland. There were about 50 in the congregation praying for loved ones in Romania. All week, Romanians in Portland have held special prayer services at their churches and public vigils for peace in their homeland and the safety of friends and relatives. With fresh U.S. troops now in Panama, the Pentagon says...
Grim sight, the bodies of civilians who were massacred at Ceausescu's orders, unearthed from the mass graves where they had been hastily buried. The people here said that the bodies had been bundled with wire and tossed into holes. Many of the victims tortured and mutilated before they died. Hundreds of anxious, grieving Romanians have come here trying to identify the bodies of relatives. It is too much for many to bear. And as the extent of the slaughter strikes home, the hatred of Ceausescu rises.
He's an oppressor, a tyrant. I think he is, as Stalin and Hitler, he is worse than that. Because if we think about Hitler, his people were shooting at other peoples, but our people to shoot our people.
The search for people connected with Ceausescu has taken an ugly turn. Mobs round up anyone suspected of being a sympathizer, often without proof. The anger is mixed with joy as people relish the prospect of a free Romania. But these changes have come at a high price for Romania. This Timișoara man, speaking German, who came to the mass grave, said all these people wanted was freedom.
That was George Lewis reporting. Since his capture, Ceausescu still hasn't been shown on Romanian television. His captors say that's to prevent any rescue attempts by his followers.
Raised, and so the British ambassador is now our guest, I understand. And so that has been a very traumatic pre-Christmas uprising. That's still going on, incidentally, but a little more control of the armed forces against the others. I really have to go. I really have to run. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. Same to you. Coming home right now.
President Bush, as he spoke just a few moments ago in the Pentagon parking lot where the helipad is, he's going to his helicopter there just about 8 or 9 minutes ago, reporting on the latest from Panama and from Romania. The president reporting that while General Noriega has not been captured yet, things look much better from the standpoint of restoring some of the order in Panama City and elsewhere in the country. He mentioned that Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, will be there. That is a reference to the fact that Secretary demolished to some extent in Bucharest. That's the first we've heard of that here. And he said the British ambassador is now the guest of the United States in the U.S. Embassy, so presumably he's all right, but no further report on what's happened. The fighting continues to some extent in Romania. The situation there has not been resolved. We'll have details of these and other stories tonight on World News Sunday over most of these ABC stations. I'm Sam Donaldson in Washington. Good afternoon. To be the inevitable, and I think he gets a lot of credit for that. I think he was the man of the decade.
I don't give a man a great deal of credit for not committing massacres.
Well, if your predecessors have done that and killed millions and millions, I think you get some. And the second man of the decade clearly was Ronald Reagan. Although I think he was to a large extent reactive. He did a lot which helped bring us to this point. For good or evil,
are we
as
allowed
time
to choose
says.
a force of the decade rather than a person of the decade? Because it was clearly in the direction of change towards the end. And I'm concerned that our country isn't changing and isn't going through a period where they're going to be able to cope with a lot of what's been called new thinking as quickly.
Well,
the number of heroes, the Hungarians were the first to let people pass through and leave the East Bloc and go into the West. And I thought they did heroic work. So did Lech Walesa. So did many others.
And the news has been so fast.
A promotional fee has been paid to ABC by United Airlines, rededicated to giving you the service you deserve. Come fly the friendly skies.
This is ABC.
Up next on Channel 2 News, former night, revolutionary authorities executed the pair today for what were termed grave crimes. Meanwhile, Portland-based medical group is getting ready to travel to Romania at the request of the U.S. State Department. As Bob High reports, Northwest Medical Teams hopes to make the trip soon, even though the fighting is far from over.
Gunfire erupted again in Romania following Christmas Day celebrations. Army troops sealed off areas of Romania's capital city, Bucharest, organizing a building-by-building search for snipers loyal to the Ceausescu regime. The 71-year-old Ceausescu and his wife Elena, who served as second-in-command, were executed Monday by firing squad after a secret military trial. A Pacific University political science professor believes Ceausescu's execution is aimed at breaking resistance from loyalist security troops.
He's being killed. It takes away from them this any kind of hope that they could change and so it means it is some inducement for them to surrender.
Portland's Northwest Medical Teams, which organized a medical relief effort for earthquake victims in Soviet Armenia, has been contacted by the State Department to prepare for a similar trip to Romania. Executive Director Ron Post is hoping for help, especially from the local Romanian community.
We right now do not know of any Romanian-speaking people in our files, so if there are people available that are medical and speak Romanian, we certainly would like to hear from them.
Northwest Medical Teams is also collecting donations to add to relief already being delivered by the Red Cross. You can contact Northwest Medical Teams during regular business hours at 624-0229. Bob High, Channel 2 News.
And there's word that a right-hand crimes against Romania. At TV Romania, which is both the voice of the revolution and its command post, some workers cried for joy.
After 40 years, you can't understand that.
The U.S. today expressed regret that the deposed leader had not been tried in public, but also established diplomatic ties with the provisional government.
Pope John Paul II.
Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena were executed, convicted today of killing 60,000 Romanians.
Sentința a rămas definitivă și a fost
The announcement was made on Romanian television, and the reaction was immediate in that country. There was cheering in the streets.
Happy, and I am emotional that I know that it will be true. Okay.
The Ceausescus ruled this country with an iron fist. The revolution against them has led to wide-scale fighting and thousands killed. Medical supplies and volunteers from throughout the world are coming into Romania now to help out. And amidst the turmoil, church services celebrating Christmas today. For the first time in years, Christmas symbols were evident in public in Romania. And the latest word from Romania is that the U.S. ambassador, Portlander Punch Green, is in good shape. He's safe. He is living at the embassy in Bucharest. Green's wife led a contingent of Americans out of Bucharest yesterday. They headed first to Bulgaria and then on to Frankfurt, West Germany.
Will the execution today of Nicolae Ceausescu finally end the bloodiest of this season's upheavals in Eastern Europe? John Donovan reports tonight from Bucharest.
This is how workers in one Bucharest hotel reacted when Romanian television announced Ceausescu's death. The broadcast said Ceausescu had been tried on 6 counts and, together with his wife, had been executed by firing squad. 2 deaths that most Romanians treated like a Christmas present. It was only 4 days ago that Ceausescu stood on this balcony in downtown Bucharest and heard himself cheered by the people, the last time they allowed themselves to be used in his fantasy that he was a beloved president. But if Ceausescu's era is over, what will follow now is still far from clear. On this Christmas Day, Romanians made the best of the holiday. It was the first time since the start of communist rule, the first time in more than 40 years, that Christmas could be celebrated this openly. But the streets of the city are not safe. Romania remains in a state of civil war. The uniformed army has decided to back the revolution that overthrew Ceausescu, but some members of his secret police force are waging guerrilla battles against the population, here and in other towns. The fighting is light during the day. It is at night when it's hard to see that the gunfire heats up and it becomes difficult to sleep. No one knows how many secret police they're fighting, whether it's hundreds of them or thousands. In theory, there is a new government made up of artists, military men, and politicians who promise the people on television that a new constitution is being prepared. But mostly there is disorganization. The streets not ruled by the army have been taken over by young men, stopping cars and passers-by in a search for secret police agents. These are people who have contained their anger at Ceausescu for years and who are for the first time experiencing a sense of their own power. They seem to relish the feeling. But they are also suffering. Romania is the only Eastern European nation this year to have failed at peaceful revolution, the only one to have spilled blood, the blood probably of thousands. And on this Christmas, thousands are simply praying and wondering when next they can sleep through a silent night. John Donovan for Nightline in Bucharest.
And finally, some unalloyed good news. This Christmas, an Iron Curtain is rising across Eastern Europe, a remarkable event that was celebrated this Christmas with a performance conducted by Leonard Bernstein at Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in East Berlin. Yes, East Berlin, where they sang not the Ode to Joy, but the Ode to Freedom. We presented, courtesy of station KCET Los Angeles, along with the names of those members of Nightline staff whose faces you do not see, whose names you probably do not know, who do nothing all year except get this show on the air. As Dickens might have put it, God bless them, everyone.
Some fighting continues, but the new government hopes the pictures of Ceausescu's execution will prompt the dictator's secret forces to surrender.
And the new government of Romania officially received U.S. diplomatic recognition today, delivered by the American ambassador Alan Punch Green. Green left his home in Portland less than a month ago to assume the post in Bucharest. This morning, he presented the message in person from President Bush to the new deputy prime minister. Later, the ambassador talked with Northwest medical teams and Channel 2 News by telephone. Green says the fighting has eased and the gunfire is only sporadic.
I walked around town for the first time they let me. I went out with 2 security guards. The students have formed around, and there's a lot of candles lit for the people, for the very brave Romanians who died.
Ambassador Green says he is still unable to return to the American embassy near the airport in Bucharest, which has been the scene of some of the heaviest fighting. Mrs. Green, other American dependents, and staff left Bucharest by automobile caravan and arrived safely in West Germany last week. And as the fighting appears to be decreasing in Romania, medical supplies are beginning to reach the wounded. Shipments from the Soviet Union and France have arrived, and the U.S. State Department has asked the Northwest Medical Team from Portland to assess the needs in Romania. And Jim Hyde reports the team may leave as soon as tomorrow.
The Northwest medical teams have responded generously before to pleas for help from Mexico City, Ethiopia, Nicaragua. That's why anxious Romanian emigres came to the offices of the volunteer organization in Tigard. And the U.S. State Department has asked the team to learn firsthand about specific medical help in Romania.
They'll go possibly as early as tomorrow to assess the needs as to what long-range help is needed in Romania. At this time, we've been told by the ambassador that medical personnel at the moment may not be needed.
Team leaders talked to Ambassador Punch Green in Bucharest by telephone. He relayed the request of the new government there, voiced by the Deputy Prime Minister. No foreign doctors and nurses yet, but all kinds of medical supplies are needed.
Surgical packs, scalpels, bandages, intraoperative medications, both antibiotics and otherwise. Probably blankets. We could use IV solutions and fluids.
Northwest medical teams have a small amount of such material on hand, but much more will be needed, from sterile syringes to blood transfusion kits. The volunteers are asking for donations of supplies from medical and pharmaceutical companies and cash to purchase more. Timing is critical.
What we would like to achieve is expedite everything. They need all the supplies right away. So a delay of one day might mean dozens or hundreds of lives we can save. So I urge everybody who is in charge to cut all the red tape and just let it go.
A Romanian Airlines cargo plane is being ready to pick up the material collected in several U.S. cities. In Tigard, Jim Hyde, Channel 2 News.
In Panama today, Romanian television after being executed by a firing squad. The Ceausescus are believed to be responsible for the deaths of 60,000 people during their reign. Here in Oregon, the Northwest Medical Team plans to leave on a fact-finding trip to determine exactly what kind of medical help Romania now needs.
Fate of deposed leader Ceausescu, photographs of Ceausescu on trial, and his body after he and his wife were executed by firing squad. As fierce civil war apparently tapered off somewhat today, the first stress cracks appeared in the new Romanian provisional government and signs of more turmoil and possible violence to come. Bob Simon is on the scene.
He was defiant to the end. The trial of Nicolae Ceausescu, broadcast on Romanian television tonight, revealed the captured leader and his wife Elena refusing to recognize the court which was accusing them of crimes against the people. Minutes later, they were dead, executed by a firing squad at an undisclosed location.
In Bucharest today, people said it was unfortunate that the man who called himself the greatest Romanian in history could die only once, and so quickly.
They all say he died too much easier, He should have been punished much more terribly.
His legacy was being dealt with outside Bucharest today. A new cemetery was under construction. The old one did not have room for 3,000 fresh graves for the victims of Ceausescu's last massacre. Children and old people, but students mainly. Students who demonstrated at Bucharest University last Saturday when Ceausescu called in the guns. New heroes, new leaders. The new government of Romania was displayed on television today. The president, Ion Ionescu, credentials, a senior communist who'd been demoted by Ceausescu and who was a friend of Gorbachev. He promised free elections in April. The tanks were still in the streets today, and there were other signs of extraordinary times, like food, more variety in more stores than people could remember, and newspapers with names like Spark of the People, Truth, Liberty. New first editions coming out every day in such demand that self-appointed town criers read them out loud to crowds. Real reprisals have not begun yet, but the old guard is being rounded up. Familiar faces spotted by people who'd been imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured. Ceausescu's poet laureate sought refuge at the American embassy, but was pulled away by an angry crowd.
And more anger is coming to the surface. The people of Romania took the extraordinary step of killing their old leader, and many are saying that the new leaders they saw on television today wear too many of the same Stalinist stripes. The Romanian Revolution may have just begun. Bob Simon, CBS News, Bucharest.
President Bush announced a $500,000 emergency aid package for Romania today, mostly medical supplies to be distributed through the International Red Cross. Additional U.S. aid is said to be in the works.
A tale of horror is emerging about the despotic reign of Nicolae Ceausescu. So hated were Ceausescu and his wife Elena that the firing squad that executed them had to be chosen by lottery because